Good evening, church history friends. I'm Wendy Eaton, and it's a pleasure to welcome you this evening. Tonight, we gather with our friend Jim Jones to learn the fascinating details behind the preservation of the Rose Hill Cemetery in Lamoni, Iowa. Rose Hill is a pretty significant site when it comes to church history, but I suspect it's equally significant for a good number of you in the audience and your own family history. We would love to hear your connections to this historic space. Drop a note in the chat if you have a friend or a family member buried at Rose Hill. In addition to seeing your comments in the chat, I want to share a couple of announcements from the Historic Sites Foundation. Peter Smith and Barbara Walden are hitting the road again. This year's trip is drawn from the nations of the world and will focus on the diverse people and contributions made throughout Community of Christ history. Our 10-day journey will take place October 6th through 15th, starting off in Independence, Missouri, and finishing in Kirtland, Ohio. Kristen is dropping a link to the tour in the chat that will take you to the tour webpage where you can learn more about the tour, as well as download the reservation form to save your seat on the bus. The tour is over half full, so be sure to reserve your seat today. This year's bus tour, our online programs, and summer internships would not be possible without your generous support. Thank you for your donations and monthly gifts. For those of you who would like to give tonight, you can see there are 3 easy ways to support the Historic Sites Foundation through online giving and gifts through the mail. Kristen will drop the online link in the chat for those wishing to make donations tonight. We know there are a lot of outstanding educational organizations out there, and we thank you for thinking of us, friends. 2 people who need no introduction are Peter Smith and Kristen Mackay. Peter is a board member for Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation and the co-host of our annual bus tours. Welcome, Peter. Kristen is also a board member, just recently welcomed on the board of directors. She is the former site director at the Joseph Smith Historic Site and past president of the John Whitmer Historical Association. Welcome, Kristen. It's a pleasure to introduce our guest speaker this evening. Jim not only studies Lamoni history, he has literally lived Lamoni history. Jim has lived in Lamoni, Iowa since 1983, where he and his wife Pat raised their 2 children. He was a professor of computer science at Graceland University, while Pat was known locally as Dr. Madley, practicing family medicine. In retirement, they enjoy traveling and spending time with their grandchildren. Jim serves on the Rose Hill Cemetery Board as webmaster, secretary-treasurer, voluntary sexton, and records manager. He created a website to help locate grave sites and led the digitization of the Lamoni's newspaper archives and historical funeral logs. Burial records, funeral logs, newspaper archives, and local histories are available at lamonirosehill.org. Welcome, Jim. We are delighted that you are joining us tonight. The Rose Hill Cemetery is a Lamoni treasure trove of church history, but is rarely in the spotlight. I'm thrilled that we're changing that tonight as we have a lot to learn from you about this historic cemetery. And we are delighted that you are joining us tonight to share your knowledge of Rose Hill. I'll hand the spotlight and microphone over to you now.
Okay, give me a second here to share my screen. And as I say, this is the title of the talk, Unearthing Truths. The kind of unearthing we're talking about here is not the literal unearthing, although sometimes I do have to do some of that to get out and probe to see if somebody really is buried where we think they are. If we can hit a not a casket so much, but a vault, which lets us know that somebody is there, or have to dig up a survey spike that lets us know where the edge of a lot is, and things like that. But what we're going to be talking about today is unearthing things through the data and through the records. And I also want to share about a particular find that has just been in the last 2 years that really uh, blew away some things that we thought we knew about Rose Hill Cemetery that weren't quite true. First of all, here is the LamoniRosehill.org website. I just want to show you what you get if you go to that. It'll open up to a home page. It looks like this. This is the site that I put together. And there's probably the most important thing for any of you to go to is go to the search menu, and you will find all kinds of resources for your historical searches for loved ones, everyone at Rose Hill, for instance, alphabetically, how they're buried, a grid map, a plat map. All of these are resources, variations on the information up here that's alphabetical, but done a little differently. And down here below, if you want to look for funeral records for your loved ones, if they happen to be in 1901 to 1955, you may want to start your search there, or the newspaper archives. So those are all, and just to very quickly show you that, if you go to the website for all the people that are buried there and you want to do a search for somebody, you can scroll through all 4,294 records, or you can zero in a little bit by, let's say we're going to talk about the dancers. So I'm trying to type dancer here, DANCER. And I can zero in on a few of the dancers and where they're buried. And this little link over on the left-hand edge, that takes you to their Find a Grave page. If they have one, they all have one. And so this is that very first, and we'll talk about that. So I'm going to close that now and get back to things are a little slow. Okay. You've already, I've already been introduced. I've moved to Lamoni in '83, retired in 2014. 2014 is also the year that I got on the Board of Trustees. I actually wanted to be on the Board of Trustees after retirement. I taught web design, and so I really wanted to create a website for the cemetery. I actually, Tom and Vicki Moraine were sitting right in front of me at church during a business meeting when they were trying to fill the vacant roles, and I tapped on Vicki's shoulder. I said, "Would you nominate me?" Because I didn't have what it takes to nominate myself. So she did, and that's how I got on. Started off as secretary treasurer, and when I say I'm records manager, I've kind of become the repository of everything old. I don't know if you can see this if I hold it slowly, because it won't blank out. This is the treasurer's log. It's a great big 2-inch thick book that goes back to 1886 to 1975 when they kind of ran out of space in it. So I've got the treasurer log, I've got the sexton's log, I've got old minutes, many things that go way back, handwritten records, but also the electronic record that I got from David Moeller, who had put it together, and something that had begun with Barb and Hale Collins, who had put that together. So I did become website manager and created the website. Some of the things that have thrown me down the rabbit hole of discovery have been the simplest of questions. Who owns Rose Hill Cemetery? That question turned out to be one that sent me down many different holes, many different paths, and looking for deeds and this kind of thing. So we're going to talk about that and the origin story and how it all connects to our history, our church history, as well as our Lamoni history. Here's that that first, with an origin story, you got to have the first, and in this case, the first. I need to move some things here out of my way. In this case, the first is the first burial. The first burial was the son, the 20-year-old son, Albert Dancer of Roselia and David Dancer. He died in November of 1881, is buried probably at that time. And the X marks where he is buried. On the left-hand side of the dotted line is the center line that cuts right through the middle of section 3. If you know anything about plats and counties and townships and how they're all divided, at least in Iowa and probably Missouri, and maybe other states as well, it's all divided up into 1 square mile sections. And if you could take those sections and split them up, divide them up into 4 horizontal lines and evenly, and 4 vertical lines evenly, you would have 16 little sub blocks, and those blocks are 40 acre. So you've heard of 40 acres and a mule, or when a farmer is given kind of the standard of 40 acres, it's often a block like that. And if you try to read the deeds, they're kind of complicated to read, but you'll read things like in the case where the dancer land is showing, that's in the southwest quarter of the southeast quarter of section 3. That's how you get to that 40 acre piece. And the Joseph Smith land would have been the southeast quarter of the southwest quarter of section 3. So it can be kind of complicated reading abstracts and reading deeds, but I've had a lot of practice now doing that and mapping out the boundaries of our properties. In the beginning, it was dancer land, and it was their own farmland, and that's where they buried their son. Today, we have an entrance that comes in. I call it the main entrance because that was the very first entrance, and even today it looks like the main entrance. It goes up the hill, hence the name Rose Hill. It goes up the hill to that main crossroad. So if you ever hear me talk about the main crossroads, that's the crossroads I'm talking about. We have other crossroads since we've expanded, but that's what I would always think of as the main crossroad at Rose Hill Cemetery. If you could draw a big circle around the main crossroad, let's say 50 yards in any direction, you would find all the most historic pioneers buried in that circumference or in that area. So come on, why aren't you working? There we go. Also today, where you can see Albert's gravestone there in the middle of this big square, David Dancer purchased nine lots, each lot being 12 feet wide, and all surrounding where Albert was buried. So eventually he purchased these 9 lots as you see them here. The lots were intended to be in that 12 feet space for 4 burials, 3 feet wide each, and that's pretty tight. You can't even do that today because of the vaults that we use. But and even then, you can see that David, Roselia, and their son Albert pretty much fill up that one lot. Like I said, all the most historic people surround this kind of area, and Elijah Banta being probably the most important one. Elijah Banta, Alma Blair referred to him as the father of Lamoni, or at least the closest thing Lamoni has to having the father of Lamoni. He's considered responsible for coming up with the name Lamoni, first for the Lamoni congregation, or the Lamoni branch as it was called, and then later he promoted it for the name of the town and pushed to get the paperwork in so that we would have the name Lamoni on the railroad station when the railroad station was first built. So Elijah Banta, name of Lamoni. He's also involved. He's involved everywhere. He was a kind of a personal confidant of Joseph Smith, who brought him to Washington, D.C. when he needed to. Joseph Smith III, when he was asked to speak before Congress on the Utah territory, he brought Elijah with him. Elijah was himself a legislator in Indiana, and after moving to Lamoni, he was a legislator in the State House of Lamoni as well, or in Iowa as well. So he's referred to as the Honorable Elijah Banta. Elijah Banta is probably the one responsible for convincing Joseph Smith to come and take a look and fall in love with this place, Lamoni, because there were other competing interests of where the church should gather. Elijah Banta was those of you that know anything about church history, you may know that there was this group called the Order of Enoch. Elijah Banta was the president of the Order of Enoch, and these other names you see around here, Henry Stebbins, of course, David Dancer, Marietta Walker, they were also part of the Order of Enoch. It was kind of a group of businessmen, and mostly men, and one or two women who were people of means, who had land, who sold, kind of promised each other, it was kind of a pact or a co-op of promised each other that they would buy up as much land as they had the money to do, and then sell that land off or make it rentable or sharecrop it or whatever to help build a community in a organized way. In other words, to get things like lumber yards and blacksmiths and the kind of farmers that we needed, and teachers and that kind of thing. The biggest shareholder of that group was David Dancer. David Dancer himself was the largest landholder in Decatur County at one point, holding as much as 1,700 to 2,000 acres of land. And to me, one thing that's interesting as I've been to the courthouse looking at things, I don't see deeds in which the Order of Enoch sold land. It appears to me that it was the individuals who bought up the land and sold the land. They were investors. Joseph Smith was not a member of the Order of Enoch. So this was wasn't really a secret society or anything like that. The only secret they might have had is to try to buy up land without causing too much of a fanfare, so they didn't get the prices driven up. But anyway, that's Henry Stebbins. You can see he's just on the south side. Henry Stebbins, you see his name all the time in church history, mostly in obituaries. He almost always was the preacher at many obituaries in the early 1900s. So he must have been a really good speaker. Marietta Walker, of course, of Graceland fame. She's just south 50 feet of this area. And another one from the next generation is William A. Hopkins, who was famous for, he was a famous entrepreneur. Built the Coliseum, built the bank downtown, was responsible for paving of our roads, tried to get street lights right after Edison got street lights in New York, in Lamoni, and got turned down for being kind of a little bit a bridge too far. One of our first, maybe our first undertaker, and he's also well known for having become president of the Jefferson Highway Association and helping make that a possibility. All of these people, you can probably read long bios about them if you go to our website and click on the history link, and then look at pioneers. I've got bios for each one of them. Let's see. So, what did we think we knew about the cemetery? First of all, if you'd asked me a couple years ago, there are a few people in town that would say, I don't know if you're able to see me moving the mouse around. It's because I'm trying to move move something that's kind of in the way on my screen. Again, the first burial was 1881. It was widely known or widely stated by Alma Blair and historians. I'm going to bring up the next slide here. Something is not working for me the way I thought. Give me just a second here. There we go. There we go. So Roselia Dancer was the person who donated the first piece of property. That's what we thought was true. If you asked me who owned the cemetery, I would have said the church is the owner of the cemetery. There are some people occasionally that will come to me and say, doesn't the city own the cemetery? And I'd say, well, no, definitely, And if you ask the city, they'll say vehemently, no, we do not own the cemetery. They do not want to be responsible for the cemetery. So I would have said the church, but in more recent years, I've learned some that the answer isn't as simple as that. We thought that Rose Hill was established in 1886 because when I opened up this treasurer's log and I look at the very first page of income, I see the very first entry is June 4th, 1886, when Elijah Banta purchased, you don't see it here, but he paid $10 for 2 lots because a lot was $5 in those days. And that was deed number 2. So you might wonder what happened to deed number 1. If I could look down, there was somebody John Scott, that bought a lot with under deed 1 in October. So I figured they started to write out the receipt for him, and then he didn't have the money. So they probably said, okay, we're not going to do that again. We're not going to start writing out deeds until we have the money in hand. So that's the only one that's out of order that I could see in the treasurer's log. But anyway, Seth M. Bass, deed number 3, and so on. So the assumption in my mind was that the cemetery clearly was being established in 1886. So that's what I thought. Also, when I went to the courthouse, the deed that I found for this first plot of land, which included the Dancer property and Albert Dancer, even though things were happening in 1886, I found the deed, and it was a 1922 deed, which was kind of odd. 20 by 40 rods, which turns out to be 330 by 660 feet. There are a couple of unanswered questions. Why was the deed in 1922? And why isn't the very first lot, as you can see here, lot 1 shows up right about here. Why didn't lot 1 start in the corner of this lot? What of the whole space? Did they want extra margin? What was that all about? So those were a couple of unanswered questions. Just to complete things a little bit, in 1898 we purchased land. This land I'm calling Land B, which was 8 by 40 rods, which turns out to be 2 acres, 132 feet by 660 feet. And that we purchased from the church. Now, I already told you that Joseph Smith owned the land on the left-hand side of that dotted line, but it turns out Joseph Smith sold most of his 40 acres, except for the 8 acres around Liberty Hall, earlier that year, earlier in 1898. Sold it to the RLDS church, sold it for $2,000, which was about $68 or $64 an acre. Anyway, we purchased that land just a few months later from the church, and that added it to the land here. Because I was a little concerned about understanding this a little more, I went to the original plat map of, I went to the original plat map of the city of Lamoni, and I could see that in 1898, they indeed thought that Rose Hill was a perfect rectangle and that it was about 7 acres. You can see it, maybe not read it, but it says 7 acres right here. And that's what we show. So, and they even have the little dotted line for the middle of the section. And I can see that it looks like, it doesn't look to scale, but at least it shows the Rose Hill Cemetery on both sides of the dotted line. So things made some sense, but still, whoops. Yeah. So now I want to show you the deeds that I uncovered at the courthouse. First of all, the first deed, or the earliest deed I was able to find, was for the parcel of land that I call B, 1898, that we purchased from the church. So here you can see we purchased from the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They were the sellers. So that kind of kicked a hole in this idea that the church owns Rose Hill Cemetery, because if they own Rose Hill Cemetery, why are we buying the land from the church? And who's the buyer? Well, the buyer is the trustees, trustees of the cemetery. But it doesn't say that. It says the trustees of the county of Decatur in the state of Iowa. So that's kind of interesting. Were we employees or how are we connected to the county? It doesn't say the church. There's no connection to the church there. It's just they're not really sure what to call us, but we're the trustees of Decatur County for the cemetery, obviously. In fact, if you look at the description, at the very end, it says for cemetery purposes. And if you read all this description, you'll figure out that we're talking about 8 by 40 rods, 2 acres. And the other thing to notice is we paid $150 for those 2 acres. Just 6 months earlier, the church bought those acres from Joseph Smith for $64. So they made a pretty good penny. So the church never really gave us a break. I mean, whenever we got land from the church, it was always the going rate and with interest if we didn't have the money. So now let's take a look at that 1922 deed for the very first parcel of land. We don't know why it was 36 years after we were already selling lots there and burying people there. But you can see that this was from the Dancer heirs. They were the sellers in this case. Walter Dancer, Anna Dancer, and his wife, and so on and so on. All the heirs of David Dancer. Who are the buyers? This time it says the trustees of Rose Hill Cemetery of the county of Decatur and the state of Iowa. One other little thing, it said that we bought it for $1. Well, that's nice. That kind of goes along with the idea that Roselia Dancer gave us the land. Because whenever you see a deed for $1, essentially that meant it was free. It was just they had to put something there. Another curious little thing here is this is the first instance in a deed where the RLDS Church is kind of tied to this idea of who these trustees are. Here it says the trustees were Mid Gordon, France, William A. Hopkins, which I mentioned earlier, and their successors in office to be elected by the Lamoni branch of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So now we have a tie-in with the church in the deed itself. That kind of indicates an affiliation of some sort with the Lamoni congregation. It's not the Lamoni congregation that bought it, it's the trustees that bought the land. And if we go down here in this description, we can see that there, if we read all this, we'll see that it was 20 by 40 rods, and that works out to be 5 acres. Now, when I looked into my treasurer's log, this is the way the treasurer's log works. The first 99 pages are used for a different purpose. They started using the income and expenses at page 100. So on the even pages, on the left-hand side, you would have the income, and on the right-hand side, you'd have the expenses. So that's how they use the accounting log. And as you can see, we've got 1886. We've got all kinds of lot sales. In fact, you can see the David Dancer purchase here. He stretched it out over 2 different deeds, 9 and 10, but he purchased for $45. He purchased nine lots, which is kind of interesting when you think about it. Here's a person that didn't feel entitled that he should be given those lots because they're the ones that they've already buried their son in one of them many years earlier. So David Dancer and Roselia Dancer weren't those kinds of entitled people. They purchased lots just like everybody else for $45. And here's that lot number 1 with John Scott purchasing it in October of 1886. But over on this side, there's a lot less detail. You notice if we just have 1886, a bunch of things that happened, 1887, a bunch of things that happened, and we don't have precise dates like we have over on the income side. We'll talk about that later. Whoops, Sorry. There we go. But there's this one entry under 1887 that says 4 1/20 acres of land for $81. Well, what's that all about? And who did we pay for that? There's no to whom paid is not even filled in. There is something up above that we'll refer to later. There's Graham and Walker. There's a $34 and then there's a $14 expense to Graham and Walker. And then there was an expense of, to somebody for 60, we bought 66 rods of fence to go around the cemetery or to go around part of it. All of those are interesting little pieces of information, but all the details aren't really there. I did try to look for Graham and Walker to see if there was a legal group or a construction group or anything in the Lamoni Chronicle or the Lamoni papers at that time that referred to Graham and Walker, and I couldn't find anybody. Of course, there was a Graham. There was a hotel named the Graham Hotel or the Graham House, I think, downtown. So there was somebody named Graham, and there was, of course, somebody named Walker. We had Marietta Walker and her husband Sam, who he was business type as well. So it could be just two individuals that we're talking about here, but we don't really know. Anyway, that led me. Okay. There we go. That led me to a couple of questions. I remember talking to Alma Blair about it. I used to joke with Alma a lot. I'd give him a call and I say, "Hey, Alma, you lied to me." And he says, "Okay, Jim, what? How did I lie to you?" And I'd say, "Yeah, you told me that Albert Dancer was the very first burial at Rose Hill Cemetery, but I've got 12 people that died before him at Rose Hill Cemetery." And he goes, "Well, I think those would be people that were disinterred and moved to Rose Hill afterwards from Sweet Home Cemetery 2 miles south." And then I do some more research and I find that, yeah, I was right. But it was always kind of fun to give him a call. I called him about this one. I said, "Hey, Alma, I've found this 4 1/20 acres sold for $81, and I have no idea why, but I can't imagine this is not somehow related to that 5 acres that we say, because there's no way we would have gone out and bought 4 1/20 acre." And Alma said to me, to my great surprise, "Jim, maybe history got it wrong." So I thought, oh, so I was on a quest to see if I could figure this out. And I didn't quite figure it out before Alma passed. I was trying to get it so I could call him back and say, "Alma, I found it," but I never quite got to that. It was another half a year before I found it. But my assumptions at this point is all I had to do is go to the courthouse, look through all the 1887 deeds, look for something, and it was sold for $81 at 4 1/20 acre, and it had to be there. If there was a sale, there was a deed. And once I found that deed, I thought the magic was going to unlock some clues that I needed. So I went to the courthouse, and it turns out it wasn't as simple as I thought. All of the 1880s and ancient deeds were way back in a back room. And when I said I wanted to look through the 1887 deeds, they brought out index books. So you start off with the index books. And they had 2 different books I could choose from. I could either look in the seller book or the buyer book. And the sellers, they were indexed by letter. So all the A sellers, all the transactions in which the seller's name began with A were in the A section. And so you would just do that. Well, I had no clue who the buyer might be. Was it the church? Was it the cemetery? Was it the county? I didn't know what the letter might be for the buyer, but I had a pretty good instinct that it was probably a D, because it was probably Dancers of some, either Roselia Dancer or David Dancer that sold it. Bad news. I got to that, and there were hundreds of sales by David Dancer. Now, this is where history comes in again. Again, if you know what I just said a little bit earlier about the Order of Enoch, David Dancer was selling property out of these 2,000 acres that he had to people establishing the town. So, of course, there was a lot of sales in the D's by David Dancer. There were also a lot of sales by Ezra Banta and others, but certainly the D's wasn't going to be very helpful. And it also wasn't helpful because I told you I wanted to see if I could find lots that sold for $81. Well, the cost of the lot wasn't mentioned in these indexes. The index lines did not have acreage and did not have the amounts. So that wasn't helpful at all. In fact, it's even worse than that. You have to actually get the deed in front of you and you have to read through all the words to even figure out what the acreage is, and you had to find the place that talked about the price. Well, the good news was that I realized that the one thing the index did say is what section that the property was involved with. So I knew it had to be in section 3, and that narrowed things down a bit. There were still a lot of lot sale transactions. So the good news was I could very quickly glance down for David Dancer's name in section 3 in 1887, and bad news. I couldn't find it. It didn't exist in 1887. So then I thought, well, 1886. I already thought the cemetery was established in 1886, so I'll ask them to give me the next earlier year. And so I went through 1886. Bad news again. It wasn't there. At that point, I was at the courthouse. I was going to keep going all the way back to 1881 if necessary, when Albert Dancer was buried. And it was in 1885 that I found it. And here's the deed. So I was very proud of finding this deed because, for one thing, in the state of Iowa, that 1922 deed, it would have been nice if the 1922 deed said something like this deed supersedes this other deed from 1885, but they don't do that in Iowa. And so I had no clue that this deed existed. You know, you had to go search for it. But this deed really unlocks some fascinating clues in my mind. First of all, it doesn't say that Roselia Dancer sold the land or donated the land or gave the land. It says David and Roselia Dancer. So they were a team. And that's the way it was. It doesn't surprise me. It doesn't mean that she wasn't instrumental in providing the land. She may have been the one that said, I want this land to go to be a cemetery where my son is buried. So that's one thing. The other thing is it was not donated, $115. And the other interesting thing here is it wasn't the $81 that shows up in the treasurer's log. So it's $115. Another interesting thing is, who are the buyers? Well, the buyers are the trustees. Let's see if I can see it. It's Elijah Banta, Roselia Dancer, and S.M. Bass, that's Seth M. Bass, trustees and their successors in office. It does not mention successors elected by the Lamoni branch. There is no connection here in the church. But a couple things that I think are significant is Elijah Banta is the president of the first board of trustees for Rose Hill Cemetery. He was kind of one of the major influencers in the town. He's getting a little old at this point, but he's still a major voice, a major leader. Roselia Dancer, she's both buyer and seller. So clearly the historians got it right about her influence. Some people say that Rose Hill is named for her, either that or because she loved roses. And if your name is Roselia, that probably causes you to love roses, but a little of both. But I certainly would believe that she probably was responsible for the name. And Seth Bass is a name you see a lot in secretary of organizations at this time in our Lamoni history. So he was secretary. So president, vice president, and secretary. All of them were prominent city leaders. Roselia is the key influencer. And again, it's not owned by RLDS or Bishop or anything like that. The other thing about this document is it is where the name Rose Hill Cemetery is documented. This is where it gets its name. At the very end of that section, it says, for a cemetery to be designated as the Rose Hill Cemetery. And you'll notice that it also spells it as two words, not a space in between. So, and if you look at the details, I'm not going to read all that. You'll find that that is 300 feet by 588 feet. If you multiply that out and go to Google and say how many acres this is, it is 4 1/20 acres. Bam! I was so happy. I was so excited when I saw that. I said, I've now made the connection between our treasurer's log. Now, the other interesting thing about this is, for this to be true, it means that the two pieces of land together are no longer rectangular. It's an odd kind of shape. But all the county plat maps show Rose Hill Cemetery as a perfect rectangle. So there are some misunderstandings. But the last thing I want you to see is the date. October the 20th, 1885. That turns out to be a significant date. I kind of stumbled on that date, realized through other kinds of things I was searching in the Lamoni newspaper archive. It turns out that Lamoni was in the middle of filing papers to become incorporated as the city of Lamoni. Now that was that was finalized in December of 1885, and it's first published in the papers in January of 1886. So, but it was in December of 1885 that we were incorporated as the city of Lamoni. But it was on October the 20th of 1885 that city leaders were there filing the papers that they had signed. A bunch of city businessmen, and signed a petition for us to become incorporated. And on that list was David Dancer and Elijah Banta and many others. And so my theory is that they were up there at the courthouse, which meant catching the train from Lamoni to Leon, so you could be at the courthouse. People didn't just go to Leon every day. They were up there filing the papers for the Lamoni's incorporation. And what that says to me is Lamoni the Rose Hill Cemetery was really being set apart to be the new city cemetery, the cemetery in the city limits. They were trying to incorporate the city of Lamoni, and they felt that we needed a cemetery. There was a cemetery, Sweet Home Cemetery, but it was a bit far away, a couple miles away. It actually was in the area where the community was gathering back in the late 70s and early 80s. But it was in 1879 when Elijah Banta was trying to get the name of the town finalized as Lamoni, because the new train station was going to be put in. And when that happened, the city central, the central city of Lamoni moved a couple miles north, or at least a mile north from where it was. The Sedgwick post office was at least a mile south of where our post office is now. And the colony, as it was known, had been gathering kind of in that area. So when the train station came in, everything kind of moved up to where it is right now. So with that in mind, here's what we now know. It wasn't 1886, it was 1885 when Rose Hill was established. It wasn't that the dancers, that Roselia Dancer donated the land, but the dancers sold us the land. And there's still some curiosities here. When I went and the way the deeds are read, I went out and I measured painstakingly 588 feet to find out where it ends. And it turns out it does not quite reach lot number 1. It falls short, like here. Now, why was that? Somehow somebody made a mistake. Maybe they were measuring from someplace north of Main Street, but all the measurements back in those days started right dead center where the border of section 3 was. If I want to get all the way up to lot 1, I need to go about 620 feet. But if I want to go all the way up to where up to this line here, I need to get to 660 feet. And as you could see, everybody seemed to think Rose Hill Cemetery was a perfect cemetery. So the assumption that everybody seemed to be making is that, including Roselia Dancer and the Dancer family, is that this space up here was being used for burials. And in fact, they started plat numbering lots up in this area up here. So now, if you take it all the way up there, 300 feet wide and all the way up to 660 feet, that adds up to about 4.5 acres, which is 6.5 acres. And you can still round that off and call this 7 acres. The other thing I noticed when I was doing all these measurements is that there was a perfect symmetry to how many rows of headstones were encompassed in that 300 feet. It was exactly 10 rows of headstones this way and this way. In fact, I'm going to show you the grid map here, the full grid map, which again exists on the website. There's a history that seems to fit even in things like the grid map. There's hidden histories here. Just in the, if you look at how the numbers, you might say, well, here's there we go. Well, I don't know how to get that to change. I guess not. Anyway, you can see here there's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and so on, all the way across to where we get to 60, lot 60, and then we drop back and start over again at 61 to 64, 65, 68, all the way over to 137 to 140. And then they do something different. They just drop down and 141 to 144, 45, and they come back this way. And then we get all the way here, then they drop down 220 to 221 and then come back. So this is kind of a surveyor's way of ordering things, except for this very first 60 lots that were numbered. So I don't know what that means. I think there's probably some history there, but you can see in the numbering that things were done at different times in our history. And you can see over here all kinds of really big late numbers that are different. Another thing you might notice is down here, there's a big block of lots that are not used. No surprise there. Somebody just wanted to have more width. Didn't want, as you came into the cemetery, they must not have wanted to have lots and headstones right up against the road. But what's weird is that when you look at the numbers here, 477, 478, 479, 480, then we jump to 489. But if you were to continue to count as if those numbers existed, it'd be 481, 82, 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, 88, 89. It's almost as if those numbers existed at one time and then they were taken out of circulation. But then they tucked those numbers in over here. They didn't want to lose the lot numbers from being used. So we have 481 over here, 482, 483, 484, 56, and so on. And all these numbers here got tucked in over here against the road. So that's kind of an interesting little fact that, okay, how do I get this rid of it? There we go. So that's one of those interesting little tidbits. And then let's complete the cycle here. There we go. So then what happened? 1922. This is where the Dancer heirs cleaned things up. Probably a lawyer came along. And not only did they fix that north border with the 5 acres, so it's no longer 4 1/20 acres, now it's 5 acres. That 5 acres includes another 30 feet to the east And that is what gives us this extra row here. And this is why we see these odd, much higher numbers that are lots that are given lot IDs much higher. And that also gives us room for this road. So up until this time, we really didn't have a road that could come up on this side. In fact, the way people would get through, they didn't have a road that went on both sides of the cemetery. They just had a road that came up the middle. And then there were these lanes. This was the F lane. And then there was an A, B, C, D, E, and F lane. There were these lanes that went through where there were no burials, but people could walk through or drive their horse and buggy through. So now we have 330 feet. We have 330 feet wide, not 300 feet wide. In fact, now we're using consistent measures, rods instead of feet. And the next, just to be complete here, also in 1922, just months later, we purchased another 5¼ acres or 5.4 acres from the church. And that is what makes up what we call the old cemetery today, where the shed is in the upper, the northeast corner. And this is also another reason why that 30 feet really needed to be acquired from the dancers. I suppose you could say we bought it for $1, because they didn't want to own a strip of land in the middle of the cemetery that we were about to expand to. So, and we paid the RLDS Church the going rate for that as well. I'm not going to show you the deed, but $1,164. And to continue the process really quickly, the expansions in 1968, we purchased from the church 24.2 acres from the RLDS Church, and we paid $6,000. At one time, I thought we didn't pay anything because if you look at the deed makes it look like it was given to us, but it wasn't. When I look in the treasurer's log, I can see that we paid the church $1,000 down, and for the next 10 years, we paid $500 a year to the RLDS Church plus 5% interest. So again, there was no gifts. And this takes us where we are today. In 1970, we sold a little bit of property back to the city, and then 2009, we gave them this property so that they could use it for their clear well and water treatment plant. We call this the old cemetery here, the new cemetery here. We have some rental property that we rent out for farmland, and we have this property here that is also farmed in hay. But those are our expansion opportunities for the future, the far future. So why was the treasurer's log so wrong? Why did it get it so wrong? It's pretty clear to me, just logically, that the treasurer's log, I can't find a date on the treasurer's log, unfortunately. I can't see when it was published, the log that we bought, but I'm thinking that it was purchased in 1900 or in the 1890s, which means that those early entries, 1886, were backdated. And the reason that the expense side was less detailed than the receipts side is because we had precise details about each of the lot purchases. We had to keep track of that, but they were going by recollections of what were the major expenses that we had. So the $81 could have just been a memory error, or if you look at one of those two Graham and Walker expenses, $34, if you add that to 81, that turns out to be $115. So maybe that's related, but that's a mystery to me at this point. Why was the 1922 deed necessary? Well, obviously the north border had to be corrected because we were already burying people on Dancer land, and the Dancer lawyers for the estate wanted to get that cleaned up for the heirs, so they didn't have to worry about that. And we also needed that other 30 feet so that we could adjoin the RSDS land that we were about to purchase. So interesting things in all this. The RLDS Church has never donated any land or funding for Rose Hill. We were always considered to be something that would stand on its own, non-sectarian. It was not, we clearly weren't intended to be a church cemetery. It was intended to be the city cemetery in some sense. All the land deeds are in the names of the trustees, not in the name of the church or the bishop or anything like that. The first real connection to the RLDS Church seems to have come, we saw a connection in the 1922 deed, but the 1901 was if you look in the Saints Herald, the bylaws, the first bylaws for Rose Hill Cemetery are established. And it's in those bylaws that the Lamoni congregation is given a prominent role as oversight authority over the board and also to elect the board of trustees. So that is the first time there seems to be a connection between a real connection between the RLDS Church and Rose Hill Cemetery. Probably because even though they were city leaders that were the board of trustees, and they could easily have said, let's have this be the city. The city council members probably said, you know, we don't really want to have to deal with it. We're happy to let the church be the overseer of this. So I also have the minutes from 1901 to 1922 of the board of trustees. Sometimes they only met a couple times a year. One couple of years they only met once a year. But I have the handwritten minutes, and I found it interesting that, well, a couple things interesting. In 1905, in the 1901 bylaws, it says that the cemetery trustees can assess 25 cents per lot whenever they need to try to help pay for expenses. And so they actually did that in 1905, which was awesome because I have page after page after page of income, 25 cents per line from all the people that paid their assessments. And the nice thing about that is that each of those lines say what the lot was for. It gives the name of the owner and the 25 cents that they paid, or 25 times however many lots they owned, and it gave the numbers of the lots, which was helpful because in the very beginning years, they didn't say what lots were purchased. They said what was the deed number. So the dancer lot just said he bought $45 on, and it gave the deed numbers. Same thing with Banta. It said Banta's deed number 2 purchased 2 lots, but it didn't say us what those lot numbers were. So I was able to triangulate things and connect what the lot numbers were to the deed numbers in those early years, just because of those entries in the treasurer's log. But in the secretarial minutes, 1905, they pretty much said, you know, this is not workable. We are not able to we have no authority to go out and get this money. It's pretty much who's willing to pay it, and we can't even contact a lot of people whose families who passed away and their families don't live here. So the decision was made, and approvals had already been made for the city to take over the cemetery. So this would be the first time we were going to relinquish the cemetery. Everybody was on board, and then that whole thing was aborted because in 1906, it was just before all this happened. The lawyers for the city must have said, hey, there's a new law that's coming out, and now cities can actually use taxpayer funding to pay non-city cemeteries for services instead of having to run their own. So starting in 1906, ever since 1906, Lamoni Rose Hill Cemetery has received some sort of a subsidy from the city. Actually, in 1906, it was both the city and also the Fayette Township. But eventually, Fayette Township stopped sending us a quarterly, the quarterly income from the tax assessment on property taxes because they had their own cemetery. But the city of Lamoni never did. They continued to pay that. And it actually reached a high point in 1971, where we got $12,000 a year from the city, which would be about $45,000 in today's numbers. And in those days, we were able to afford having a full-time caretaker and who actually did the burials and helped install the stones and that sort of thing. We don't do any of that today. The city still, though, does gives us a subsidy, something about covers about a third of our costs. And so what is our relationship to the church today? If you ask the headquarters legal, they would say Rose Hill is a wholly owned affiliate of Lamoni Congregation, and it gets its 501c3 status through the parent organization, Community of Christ, headquartered in Independence. So that's kind of who we are. We're not owned by the church, but we are certainly an affiliate, and that's how we're able to get our tax status. Oh, geez, let's see. We started. I'm going to go quickly through a couple of things here because I want to acknowledge how we got to where we got with electronic records. And I have a lot of people to thank for that, but how do you get electronic records in the first place? It started with probably Hale Collins and Barbara Lee, who had access to all of these things we're talking about, the sexton log, the headstones. Well, here's a quick look at what the sexton log looked like. It's kind of in poor shape. There are some pages you can't read at all. Somebody took a piece of paper, wrote down the lot numbers, divided it into 4 sections for the 4 spaces. Sometimes burials spanned across spaces, and they'd write them like this: Elijah Banta across here, Mary Banta, William Banta. Sometimes they forgot to write who was buried there. This is actually where the dancers are buried. It didn't even get written into the sexton log, probably because it was all that happened before the sexton log was created. There was a headstone record. Barbara Lee Collins and Arlene Tilford walked through the cemetery. It was probably back in the 80s and 90s. They walked through and painstakingly wrote down every single inscription, line by line, the way it looked on the headstone, and they brought those back. And so sometimes they weren't sure about something, they had a question mark, and that actually led to a problem at one point because the question mark got dropped in the database, and it turns out these were not the right numbers. Their question mark was a correct one. But this is the dancer section where Albert Dancer. This is what Albert Dancer. This is Roselia and David Dancer, and David Dancer's sisters that are in that center section. We also had, come on, we had obituaries. I won't click this, but this would just take you to the Lamoni Chronicle or the Lamoni newspaper website. There's funeral logs that you can take a look at. There's a plat map. I'll show you what the plat map looks like. It's kind of degraded. There on the plat map, they actually wrote the names of who bought the lots, but sometimes they forgot to update them when they got sold back, or when somebody else got buried there, that they said this person can be buried there. So these names may not be correct. And also you can see that some of it was quite degraded. Like this is the dancer lot right here, and you can barely read it. And so that was plot sales, lot owners. Also, all of these things tended to have abbreviated names and didn't have the kind of information that we would need. Back in the 1990s, the World Wide Web was formed. And that, in other words, web pages began in 1991. And the 1990s was the Wild Wild West. Sometimes people say WWW stood for the Wild Wild West. everybody was trying to get data up on the web so that people could, I don't know, could have fun with it, could research with it, get things like earthquake data up in the internet, get cemetery data up, get recipes up, get everything up. And we were part of that. In fact, there's a list. One volunteer pointed this out to me. I didn't know it existed, but I sometimes go to this link. It's still up on the web, and this kind of there it is. This kind of shows me what the data looked like that we uploaded to the world back in the early 90s and mid 90s. And here you can see the kind of information we had. Even though we had a field for birth and death dates, a lot of them weren't even filled in. But we had the plot and the space within the plot, the grave with it, whether somebody was cremated or not. We have abbreviated names. We have misspelled names. Here we have Ackerley without L-E-Y, whereas Ackerley is spelled with an L-E-Y. Here we have a woman's name is not even there. It's Mrs. Albert Ackerley. We have infant of Henry, Margaret. Here we don't have the full name. We have R. Henry. So this is the kind of data we had based upon either what we found on headstones. Like here we have some dates, 1882 to 1994. That probably was taken off a headstone. And if we had anything more detailed like this one, 1996, somebody happened to know what the date was, but they didn't know what the birth date. That got picked up by Ancestry.com, Find a Grave, and all kinds of others. And odd, silly little fact, I often go to Find a Grave to update my own burial records when I see that the dates of birth and death are more detailed on Find a Grave than what I have. I'll sometimes update that in my records because the date of birth and death was never included in any of our records. Cemeteries don't usually record those kinds of information. They just want to know a name and where they're buried so they don't accidentally dig somebody up and try to bury somebody else there. So, and now I've added to this because we now have our own website with our own data, and I see this as the official data that everybody should go to. Anyway, it's an interesting thing to realize that we got some circularity going on. I could be grabbing something from Find a Grave that I think is more correct than what I have, not realizing that that might be old data that's really incorrect. So we got this circularity going. That could be a problem. There's a lot of advantages to having electronic data. I mean, you can sort it, you can search it. There are so many things you can do when you have things electronic in a database. You can ask questions that you couldn't ask with the handwritten records. For instance, I could ask, who died most recently? All I got to do is take the database, sort it by the date of death, and I can see who pops up first and who pops up last. And I can also do a little bit of coding, and I can say, calculate the difference between the birth date and the death date, and then sort by that. And I can find out who's the oldest person buried at Rose Hill and who's the youngest. I can sort by lot ID, and I can find out who all is buried in lot 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, there is no 1, 2, 3, 4. Who's buried in 225. And I can also do more clever things. Dave Moeller did this with the database. He came up with some ways of sorting, writing a report so the database would order things in the order that you would encounter them if you walked row by row down through the cemetery. That's not quite the same as sorting it by lot ID because the lot ID numbers are not, as you saw in the grid map, they don't line up as you walk down. So it takes a little more effort there. In all of these cases, you find outliers, and those outliers help you find errors in your data. For instance, if you see somebody that's got a negative age, Well, what's that all about? Well, maybe it's because they accidentally swapped the birth date for the death date, whoever was typing it in. So then you can figure that out. Or maybe somebody that was born in 1884 and they died in 1974, when somebody typed in their birth date, they accidentally typed 1984 instead of 1884. That happened all the time. So when you start doing these little sorts and things like that, you start finding outliers that make no sense, and that uncovers errors. Um, the disadvantage with going electronic is, oddly, electronic records have a shorter lifespan than handwritten records. I mean, I've got these records. I'm looking back at 1886. Um, in the handwritten records. But the irony is this book ends in 1975. What happened in 1975? I have this big gap between what financially happened in Rose Hill Cemetery from 1975 to 2000. Well, what was going on then? Well, that was the microcomputer craze. Everybody had microcomputers, and Hale Collins had a microcomputer. That's how he got into this whole thing. He wanted to do what me or anybody else would want to do, put it on a computer. But the problem is, 30, 40 years later, when I go back and get Hale Collins's old files, I don't have any software that can read or open those files. And if it can, it sometimes opens them up incorrectly. Um, so all of the, unless somebody is every 5 years converting the data to new formats and new media, you're going to be in trouble. So, well, I was going to show you something here, and I don't know that I have the time to do that. I'm really running out of time. But one of the things that we did discover is when I was going down through a report that sorted the lot, all the burials in the order that you encounter them when you walk down the rows. I walked down the most historic row of all, and the dancers were missing. And I thought, wait a minute, this makes no sense. This has to be me making a mistake. And turns out the mistake was, well, let's see, I'm just running through some dancer stuff here. The mistake was kind of an interesting one. As I've already mentioned, there was a question mark here, and that turns out to be the wrong numbers. They were in the next row, and there was even a bigger mistake made here because whoever read this this page saw the word dancer here, which was really intended to be part of this headstone, and they somehow thought that must be related to these names down here. And so these were headstones that faced the other way and only had last names, or sorry, first names. So the assumption was Alfred A., Ruth E., and Helen V. were dancer children, infants that died. And so those got entered in the database that way. And it wasn't until 2020 that this is what those headstones look like that are facing the opposite direction. The assumption must have been made that this is the row, and these guys were on this side of the row, and they're buried over here. They might have made that assumption because the inscription's on the other side of the headstone, and usually the burials are on the flip side from where the inscription is. But that's not the way it was done. In fact, these stones are on that side, so they're in these rows, or in these lots, not in these lots. And these children were not inside the dancer lot, they were outside the dancer lot. In fact, they were the children of Henry Stebbins. So it wasn't until 2020 that these children got the right names. And not only that, Alfred A., we have Ruth E., Helen V., and Alfred A. was really Alfreda. So we even had the sex wrong here in the name. Another, and this is the last one here. This was a thing that threw me off for a long, long, long time. We have this person named an infant that just had a temporary marker. And I I couldn't find this person. I couldn't find an obituary. I couldn't find anything. James A. Ballantyne, born and died 1921, in lot 672. But eventually I came across an obituary, and then I even came across a funeral record for a James A. Ballantyne. And the funeral record was really quite interesting. So I will show you an example of a funeral record. And again, you can get to these from our website. James Arthur Ballantyne, and I can see right there, he was buried in lot 672. And we can find out how much his vault cost and other kinds of information, time of death, and things like that. A lot of times in the very bottom, they'll even put notes that the funeral director would put for the obituary, like who the pallbearers were and who the singers were, and that sort of thing. So clearly, this is the wrong James Ballantyne. So I called the family, and nobody could remember. Um, and finally, after years of thinking about this and worrying about this, it finally occurred to me when I looked carefully at this temporary funeral marker. The funeral marker was for White Marsh Services. White Marsh Services did not exist until 1941. That's when White Funeral Home got taken over by Marsh Funeral Home, but White said, I'll continue to help, and they just called it the White Marsh Funeral Home. And so it wasn't until 1941 that that name existed. That means that somebody came to the funeral home and said, hey, we've got an unmarked grave for James A. Ballantyne, and we really like to have something. Could you put one of your temporary markers together so that we could put it in there? And he said, sure. What was his name? What was the dates? And they simply didn't remember the right dates. They said, oh, 1921. And so this is the kind of way that errors find their way into into the data. I want to end with acknowledgments to Hale and Barbara Lee Collins, who and her friend Arlene Tilford, and other volunteers, but they really got the first electronic database together. Alma Blair is the one that also helped them and came up with the concept of a grid map. I've changed it considerably so that but he's the one that came up with the idea of using a spreadsheet to lay it out. And it is different today than what it was, but Alma Blair did a lot of that, and he also answered a lot of my questions. David Moeller was instrumental in actually taking the Collins database from early microcomputers and putting it onto Access and doing some pretty clever reports. And there have been many, many, many volunteers and boards and others. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing.
Well, thank you, Jim, for sharing your knowledge of Rose Hill and enlightening us to the recent discoveries that have been made about Rose Hill's history. And a special thank you to our guest as well for sharing your personal connections to Rose Hill Cemetery. Those were a lot of fun to read. Well, our evening has flown by, and I'm sorry to say that it's time to draw our time together to a close. Thank you, Jim, for sharing your knowledge with us tonight. Also, a big thank you to Peter, Kristen, and Barb for helping out behind the scenes and continuing to make it look so easy. We also want to thank everyone for joining us tonight and for your continuing interest in church history and for the love of a good story, as well as your generous support for Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation. We couldn't do programs like this without you. Thank you. We hope that you will join us next week when we welcome Tony Chavala Smith to the Spring Lecture Series. Tony will explore the theological and historical context of the Nauvoo Expositor in a lecture he has called The Nauvoo Expositor and the Origins of the Reorganization's Theology. It's a lecture you do not want to miss. Peter has dropped a link in the chat where you can register and save your online seat. It's hard to believe that next Thursday's program will be our last lecture in the spring lecture series. What an educational journey we have shared over the last few weeks. Thanks again for joining us tonight. We look forward to sharing with you next week. In the meantime, keep reading your church history and take care, friends.